First and foremost, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our ARCA Webinar Series. This professional development opportunity is being brought to you by the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association, or ARCA, and it is currently offering both NBCC and CRCC continuing education for those who have registered in advance. All educational content provided by ARCA is meant to increase knowledge, skills, and awareness about disability education and rehabilitation counseling to better serve providers, educators, and students who may be working with persons with disabilities. My name is Dr. Daniel Balva, and I'm the president-elect of the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association. And today I have the wonderful honor to serve as your moderator for this presentation. Before we get started, just want to share a few reminders. Please make sure throughout this presentation that your microphones are muted. Please do feel free to ask questions anytime during the presentation using the chat box. We'll be moderating those questions and Dr. McCarthy will answer them at the end of today's webinar. Today's session is also being recorded, and again, viewing options will be available on the ARCA website in the upcoming days. And after the presentation, those of you who have signed up for continuing education will receive an email with a link to the evaluation, which is also in the chat, which will be in the chat box today as well. After completion of the evaluation, you will receive a continuing education certificate for your records in the upcoming days. At this time, please allow me to present today's webinar presenter, who we are honored to have with us today. Dr. Henry Germain-McCarthy is a past president of ARCA and professor emeritus at LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans, after serving 31 years on the faculty doing teaching, scholarship, supervision, community service, and advocacy. His professional work has taken him to about 50 cities in Canada, the Caribbean, Central America, Europe, and the US. He remains engaged in doing consultation on disability issues and volunteer work for various community, cultural, peace, and social justice organizations. Dr. McCarthy, thank you so incredibly much for being here with us today. We appreciate your time, expertise, and commitment to advocacy and collaboration for disability justice. And without further ado, the floor is now yours.
Yeah, well, they're looking at my thing. Good morning, everyone. I'm Henry, and I'm really glad to be here this morning. I have a little technical glitch on my screen, which we're resolving, but at any rate, I'm really pleased to have you here, and thanks for coming. And just to let you know that we will have time for questions that are inputted to the chat box, and I am willing to stay after the scheduled time for as long as people still have questions or points of discussion. And so I will move forward with, oh, by the way, I've prepared a lot of material, and I'm choosing to read every slide, and I apologize for doing that. However, if I just spoke extemporaneously, we would definitely go over time, because I would be including all these embellishments and tangents, etc. So
you can use this to move it.
Well,
ask them if they see that.
Yeah. Daniel and Vicky, can you see in my screen this meeting is being recorded by the host or a participant?
You can.
And then it gives you the option to say got it. That I can't.
Yeah, the recording is going. So
right, but I can't delete that chat that message box from the screen. Are you seeing it?
Yeah, we're seeing it, but it will stay up there, Henry. But don't worry about it, because we can see your PowerPoint.
Okay,
so you're good.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. If one of you wants to share your screen like Daniel to eliminate that distraction, that's fine with me. I don't know whether it would stay on with them, etc. Well, at any rate, welcome. Here are the goals for my presentation are on the flyer: to increase awareness of the rich legacy of the disability rights movement in creating the consciousness, culture, and legislation that reframed best practice to disability issues, from one of charity or dominance of professional expertise to that of upholding human rights in partnership with the disability community for holistic quality of life, to encourage attendees to engage in advocacy and collaboration with the disability community to maintain and expand disability rights, and to promote the disability community as an essential resource that counselors should actively seek and partner with to provide optimum services and accommodations for inclusive education, employment, healthcare, and wellness. And this is what the content of today's presentation will be. I'll be sharing experiences and relationships from my personal and professional life that have taught me about social justice advocacy and led me to be an ally with the disability community for equity and inclusion. There'll be brief biographies of several pioneers and leaders in the disability rights and disability pride movements whose perspectives and spirit and work I have admired, promoted, and believe are essential to effective rehabilitation counseling, education, and practice. I'll give a very brief summary of the disability justice movement and offer encouragement for our profession to embrace, not just acknowledge, the legacy and current agendas of the disability community, and to develop meaningful, mutually beneficial partnership practices and programs with them.
And Dr. McCarthy, I
Yes.
apologize for the interruption, but
No.
we did have a comment in the chat box that there should be a button up top that says "Got it" or "Accept" that will allow you to remove that bubble that popped up about the recording.
Right. The problem is I cannot get my mouse to function. I can't get to that "Got it" thing because my mouse is not cooperating, and we've changed mice. And so I mean, it will advance the slides, but it will not, it doesn't give me a cursor that I can click on that "Got it" button.
Okay.
So yeah, I think if you shared your screen, Daniel, then it might not, or you can delete it.
Okay, I'll try to share my screen. I apologize for.
Oh no, it's not. It's my ineptness with technology, and
No, not at all.
so. I have an excuse because I was born in the 18th century, and so we're slow to catch up. Yeah. All right, I'm just going to. So I should eliminate screen sharing because you're going to do it, Daniel?
Yes, it should be sharing for everybody at this time. Can you see that on the screen?
Yeah, I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen so that I can just, oh, here, I got it. There. It made it work. All right. So I just reviewed the content of what I'll be offering. And so next, this is.
And Dr. McCarthy,
here.
I'll advance the
Right,
slides. so
okay.
feel free to-
So I'm going to start with how I got to be interested in advocacy for social justice issues. As a teenager in the 1960s, I was shocked by the horrible violence and discrimination against African Americans, which I was exposed to through media coverage of civil rights marches and struggles. Starting in 1966, I sought out volunteer work where I could learn more and try to do something to reduce those injustices. I was fortunate to have good awareness-raising experiences, learning in African American communities from their local leaders. Two such experiences occurred during my freshman year of college. The first was a service learning trip I took with a professor and a few fellow students to promote Black voting rights in Mississippi. This was in the days when they had voter registration camps, et cetera. And the second was right after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April of 1968, whose commitment to nonviolent activism I very much admired. I helped the college raise funds for scholarships dedicated for Black students. These experiences were my first foray into advocacy for social justice issues. I acknowledge with gratitude how they helped encourage and inform those interests of mine that I have incorporated into my career and continue to develop in my retirement. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So disability rights, education, and advocacy is part of my evolving human rights consciousness. As an undergrad, I majored in psychology and chose summer jobs each year in a related setting to give myself hands-on exposure to different specialties and client populations within psychology. The first summer I worked in a recreational program that I and 2 other college students organized and conducted for youth with behavioral disorders that were clients of a community mental health center, and this was their summer program. The next year, I was a dormitory attendant in a large residential center for adults with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. The third summer, I worked as a nursing aide in a long-term care facility, which we'll call SJG, for men with physical disabilities. We were short-staffed, and the work was the most demanding and exhausting I have ever done. That job was also the most intriguing and interpersonally enriching one I had ever had, and it started me on a career path that I pursued for the next 46 years. And so now I will introduce 3 men that I worked with that summer as their caregiver. Francis White never went to school, but he was my most memorable teacher about living with disability. My first teachers in my chosen vocation to serve people with disabilities were 3 residents of the SJG nursing facility where I worked in the summers of 70, 71, and 72. The first one was the most influential. His name was Francis White, and he was unlike any person I had ever met in many ways. He never went to school because he was truly, quote, bedbound due to major congenital malformations or deformities of his torso and extremities, a condition called arthrogryposis multiplex, that prevented him from adequately breathing if he sat in an upright position for any extended period of time in a chair, or from doing any physical activities of daily living. He also lived because of the contractures in his arms and legs. He also lived in a highly discriminatory era when many kids with even milder disabilities were denied regular schooling. Francis was more than 40 years older than I, but we became great friends. As I bathed, dressed, and fed him, I listened with fascination as he shared his mind and his life with me, a world of hobbies and relationships far from the single bed that he never left. I wrote letters that he dictated to pen pals he had in several cities around the globe. He learned Italian from listening to opera on public radio. With a sense of humor and an accepting ego, he transcended the physical and social limitations that he had been handed. Today, some disabled activists disparage any such stories of, quote, super crips as condescending stereotypes or exploitive inspiration porn. And if that's a new term for you, you can see some TED Talks about that topic. For me, Francis's expansive appreciation of life was so worth my learning from, regardless of the abilities, age, or social position of this person whom I looked up to and enjoyed being with. Okay, next. And now I'll talk about 2 other residents at that facility who sparked my interest in understanding the disability experience. The second one, another friend at this facility, was Bobby Wong. He was placed there because he had quadriplegia and his family did not have adequate capacity for his care. He was about my age at that time and he appreciated that I cared about his isolation there, being the youngest resident by many decades and the only deaf person. We kept in touch after I left that job and moved far away. I shared in his delight when a few years later, he wrote to me that he was working at the nearby Independent Living Center, and I then visited him in his own apartment, which was a big change, as you can imagine, from living in a nursing facility. The third person I'll talk about was Mr. L, and he was a sharp contrast to Francis and Bobby. He complained often that the staff were slow or inept in providing his care, and that he had no intellectual stimulation there. He told me of being denied admission to nearby Harvard University in 1940 when they learned he was disabled and used a power wheelchair. By far, he had the most developed personal assets and family support of all the men at the facility, but he seemed miserable about his life. I pondered these three men's ways of being in the world and took the only path I was aware of at age 21 for reacting helpfully. I went to grad school in rehabilitation psychology to learn more about the varied disability experiences I had observed. So now I'm going to talk about 9 advocates and thought leaders in the disability community who have most influenced me in my career and personal life. I've had the privilege to learn from many impressive thought leaders and advocates in the disability rights movement through their publications, presentations, consultations, legislative lobbying, public education, and other contributions to the movement. I will highlight 9 of them who have had the most influence on my disability justice awareness and my desire to spread the wisdom and inspiration of their work. I studied their contributions, had the opportunity to meet all of them, and worked collaboratively with several of them for at least a few years. I will briefly summarize their place in my pantheon of great mentors and colleagues, and will identify the areas of their expertise that especially piqued my interest. They are given in alphabetical order without noting their degrees because their identities and achievements were grounded in justice work, not the fame or prestige that their superb talents earned them. And I have a couple of citations here that are compiled in a reference list that I shared with ARCA, and they can share it with all of you registrants. So the first is Adrienne Ash. She lived from 1946 to 2013. She was a real strong feminist scholar in disability studies, a past president of a Society for Disability Studies, a bioethicist, a mentor, and an accomplished vocalist. So this is Adrienne's story. Upon graduation from Swarthmore College, which is a really renowned academic powerhouse, she was rejected for every job she applied for and told outright by many employers it was simply because she was blind. She once insisted on staying on site until she was interviewed, but was forced to leave by the security staff. She tried to file a job discrimination case, but there was no such federal or state law based on disability at that time. She started lobbying for one and didn't stop until the New York Human Rights Law, that's the state that she lived in at the time, was amended in 1974 to include disability status. Adrienne was skilled in promoting equity for women and disabled folks through a range of interpersonal approaches. She was a consultant to many groups and organizations around the world. She was a licensed therapist. She was a professor and directed research projects. She was also renowned as an expert on the impact of attitudes about disability on bioethical decisions about the value and lives of the unborn and people with disabilities in physically highly dependent situations, where issues of withdrawing nurturance that kept people alive were an issue. This memorial tribute perfectly captures Adrian's intellect and personality, and I excerpted this from an obituary that was in a science journal. Ash had an endearing ability to be at once gracious and confrontational, passionate and prickly. She was always open to differing views, but she never compromised her insistence on absolute respect for the lives and perspectives of people with disabilities. She was known for asking probing questions to identify common values and expose disagreements that needed to be hashed out. Next is Susan Daniels, who lived from 1948 to 2011. She was a fabulous educator, a disability policy innovator, a motivational speaker, an early adopter of technology, and what I call a funtrepreneur, which is an entrepreneur of good times. I knew Susan the best of the leaders I'm highlighting in this talk. We were work colleagues and close in age, but she was so astute, clever, and helpfully frank that often I felt like she was my mentor. She certainly was for many people. Starting in the 1970s, she did groundbreaking workshops and authored publications on sexuality and disability for folks with a disability, parents, and various healthcare professionals, many of whom simply avoided the topic due to their discomfort or lack of appropriate training. Just one example, we were both on the faculty at LSU Health Sciences Center, and she found out that many of the physicians would routinely not give women who were on schedule for having a pap smear, not be given a pap smear. And so she went to the department head of OBGYN and soon thereafter was doing training for all of their advanced students and residents and fellows. This excerpt describes one of her major policy achievements. Quote, and this is from the Disability Policy Works website, which is an organization that Susan founded after she retired from being the #2 person in the Social Security Administration. She was both a policy wonk and an activist, and was as comfortable debating scholarly economists as organizing community stakeholders. Perhaps Susan's greatest accomplishment was the Ticket to Work and Work Incentive Improvement Act of 1999 that created employment incentives and healthcare provisions for workers with disabilities and removed many of the systemic barriers that force many individuals with disabilities to choose between health coverage and work. Susan was unusual and truly endearing because of the balance she demonstrated in her life. She was passionate about both the serious work she pursued and the fun times she created for her colleagues and friends, including being one of the organizers of the first and maybe only Disability Pride inaugural ball, which was held in DC for Obama's first inauguration. And I got to go as one of her guests, and it was a fabulous experience. And just the way that she could do all sorts of awareness raising about disability rights in all sorts of fun ways, like an inaugural ball. Next is Justin Dart Jr., who lived from 1930 to 2002. He was a disability and economic justice activist, a coalition builder, and a kind heart. Justin was born into a wealthy family basically sort of trust fund baby. He got polio as a teenager and later succeeded in the family business. He resigned in mid-career to devote his life to humanitarian service. He pursued disability rights through varied advocacy strategies in federal government positions, legislative lobbying, and grassroots organizing. He visited all 50 United States at least 5 times at his own expense to educate citizens and to advocate for passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Then he focused his efforts on healthcare reform and economic justice. He and his wife, Yoshiko, mentored many immigrant women in a cooperative living and learning arrangement in their home. He was adept at coalition building, as expressed in this quote that summarizes his mission. Empowerment is when government joins with business, labor, religion, and individual citizens to guarantee every person the tools to govern, to produce, and to live the best life possible for self and for all. And here's a picture of the signing ceremony for the Americans with Disabilities Act on July 26, 1990, as you all know. And you can see Justin is on the far right. He is eminently distinguishable in every photograph because he wore a cowboy hat everywhere he went. And now I'll take a little pause from my 9 members of my pantheon to make a comment on viewing the photo of the ADA signing ceremony. So in the first row was Evan Kemp, and then the elder President Bush and Justin Dart. And in the second row of that photograph was Reverend Harold Wilkie, who was an ordained minister, I believe, Presbyterian, and Sandra Perino. I met Reverend Wilkie, who lived from 1914 to 2003, at a lecture he gave in 1972 when I was a first-year graduate student. And he was a friend of Beatrice Wright's, who was my major advisor, and she would have him come whenever he was in the area and talk to the students. I am thankful to him and later to the transformative thinking of rehab psychologist Carolyn Vash, who lived from 1934 to 2015, who also had a disability, for cultivating my interest in exploring the varied connections between spirituality and disability. I was privileged to collaborate with each of them on presentations and publications, from which I learned a lot. Next is Lex Friedan. He's a disability policy expert, a pioneer of independent living services, a researcher, and a disability ambassador. Lex has a long legacy in disability advocacy, policymaking, and the community living movement. His networking, lobbying, and writing were instrumental in shaping the ADA of 1990. He also led the federal panel for its 2008 amendments. He was one of the pioneers in the philosophy, policy, and research regarding the independent living movement and continues in that leadership role. Through his own life-threatening experiences as an electric wheelchair user during hurricanes and power failures, including a flood in his home where the flooding stopped just above waist level, and so he was saved by it's not going any farther as a person using an electric wheelchair who would not have had the ability to escape from the room that he was in. He developed expertise in preparedness, evacuation, and support needs of persons with disabilities in such crises and disasters. Lex is highly experienced in working multilaterally within political and governmental systems, consumer and provider organizations, and rehabilitation associations nationwide and internationally. Next is Eileen Heron. She is a disability rights activist, a developer of a business enterprise to employ folks with disabilities, a mentor to many, and an accomplished artist. Eileen is the founder and executive director of ARCA, which is a collective of disabled self-advocates working on human rights, independent living, vocational training in their small business, Chicali Ceramics in El Salvador, in the capital city of San Salvador, which is where I first met her when I was doing a program evaluation. And they do beautiful work. Many of them are artists and the others are, business people who do the books, etc. This multi-talented leader has held several posts in Disabled Peoples International, including chair of the Latin American Women's Committee. She led a unique project in which more than 100 Salvadorans with disabilities were trained and accredited to monitor their 2003 national elections for president. Eileen affirms, democracy can only be built with the participation of all. Otherwise, democracy is not genuine. She wants her epitaph to say, you don't have to walk in order to fly. And next is Judy Heumann, which I'm sure everyone knows, an icon of our profession and movement. She's a disability rights activist, an icon of disability pride and self-determination, and co-founder of World Institute on Disability. And she has her sign 504 sign, and I'm going to be mentioning that in the next slide, where she was one of the leaders of that sit-in protest to get the then Secretary Califano of HEW to sign the regulations for implementing the Rehab Act of the 504 regulations, excuse me. Okay. Because she used a wheelchair, Judy was denied both kindergarten admission and, several years later, a teaching job upon college graduation. These and other discriminations fueled Judy's lifelong fight for disability rights. Her parents won the first battle against the school principal, so they were very assertive and got to get her enrolled in kindergarten, and she went through all public schools in Brooklyn. Judy won the second one by suing the New York City school system for job discrimination and was hired in a teaching job. In 1970, Judy and some fellow activists in Brooklyn founded Disabled in Action, a civil rights organization committed to ending discrimination against people with all disabilities. In 1977, Judy was a leader of 150 disabled people who locked themselves in the San Francisco Federal Building, which I've read is the longest sit-in protest in US history, successfully demanding the official implementation of the 1974 law prohibiting disability discrimination in federally supported programs. Note this quote from her 2021 memoir, which is called Being Human, the life of an unrepentant activist, or something close to that. It's given correctly in the references list. Quote, change never happens at the pace we think it should. It happens over years of people joining together, strategizing, sharing, and pulling all the levers they possibly can. Things start to happen, and then suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, something will tip. Crip Camp, which came out in 2020, is a fabulous documentary film of one summer at a sleepaway camp for youth with disabilities, where Judy worked as a counselor and demonstrated her passion for educating peers and youth about self-determination of disabled people. Next is Ralph Hotchkiss. In his workshop, he is a designer of sustainable wheelchairs, an entrepreneur educator of folks with disabilities in under-resourced nations, and a disability justice activist. In 1980, Ralph started working tirelessly to design effective, sustainable wheelchairs that, and this is what makes them effective and sustainable, they can handle rough or otherwise unmanageable terrains, whether they are mountainous areas or swampy terrains, etc., and can be constructed completely with locally available parts. So nothing has to be imported when the wheelchair breaks down or needs a replacement. He taught disabled folks in under-resourced countries worldwide how to maintain and repair the rugged wheelchairs and assisted them to turn these skills into income-generating, sustainable small business enterprises. His innovative rehabilitation engineering work earned him a MacArthur Foundation, colloquially called the Genius Grant. This enabled him to expand his enterprise by co-founding Whirlwind Wheelchair Incorporated, that now manufactures and or distributes durable wheelchairs in 60 countries. As its website explains, a wheelchair is not just hardware, but a means of self-actualization and social change. Quote, a functional wheelchair designed for the challenges of its environment is a tool that enhances the rider's ability to participate in family, social, and economic activities. It also enhances public perception of the capabilities and value of people with disabilities because they're out and about functioning in their communities. Next is Harry Lang. He is a scholar of the culture, education, and history of deaf people. He's a science educator and a prolific author. Harry is among the most prolific and well-rounded persons I've known, as exemplified by these diverse interests and accomplishments. He has almost 100 publications, including 15 books, many of them on varied topics that highlight the contemporary and historical contributions of deaf persons. Subjects include activists, actors, athletes, entrepreneurs, journalists, scientists, soldiers, teachers, and technologists. His international stature in deaf studies and research on science education has brought him into scholarly activities with many famous scientists, such as Stephen Hawking, Carl Sagan, Linus Pauling, and Isaac Asimov. Nonetheless, his heart and soul are focused on practical tools for the equitable and effective education of deaf students at all levels in the appreciation of deaf culture. For example, he created an American Sign Language online lexicon of technical terms in math and science and co-authored the widely used textbook, Educating Deaf Students. He has served as a consultant and content expert for documentary films, museum exhibitions, professional associations, in many schools. All the while, he is a down-to-earth, witty guy who loves to tell jokes. Next is Peg Nozick, who lived from 1952 to 2020. She was a disability justice activist, a director of research projects on women's wellness, an accomplished musician with a master's degree in music composition and performance, and a prolific author. And I like this picture of Peg shown welcoming a large dog at her home, just as she embraced all aspects of living. Peg's prolific publication list, 96 journal articles and 25 book chapters, made her well known to many people worldwide. Her topics of interest were wide-ranging: sexuality, spirituality, independent living, assistive technology, and universal health care. She was equally skilled and engaged in various methods of improving life for her disability peers, such as designing rigorous research projects, founding and directing the Independent Living Center in Austin, Texas, joining advocacy demonstrations in the streets, and consulting online. In 1993, Peg founded and served until her death as the executive director of the Center for Research on Women with Disabilities in Houston, Texas, where she directed research and training projects funded by the most respected competitive granting agencies in the US. She loved technology and innovative thinking. For example, some of her latest studies were conducted using the metaverse Second Life, where she actually collects data from participants who are enjoy Second Life as a platform for community and imagining their life in another world. Next. Okay. Here are some other resources that taught me about self-advocacy, self-determination, and self-help. I learned from many other movers, shakers, and trailblazers in disability groups or organizations whose work I was honored to participate in and promote, and from persons who helped me be a better teacher, scholar, or advocate. I thank them for accepting me into their exemplary work. The first is ADAPT, which currently stands for American Disabled for Attendant Programs Today, and they do sort of guerrilla grassroots advocacy work and lobbying to make the funding for Medicare and Medicaid for long-term care go primarily to individuals to hire their own caregivers and live in the residence of their choice, rather than the bulk of it going to the nursing home industry, which is the current situation. The Council on Aging in Lawrence, Kansas, the Mayor's Advisory Council on Disability Issues, the Organization of People Undaunted by Stroke, peer counselors at the National Spinal Cord Injury Association New Orleans chapter, peer counselors at New England Rehabilitation Hospital in Woburn, Massachusetts, the Society for Disability Studies, the Vietnam Veterans Drop-In Center in Queens, New York, and many of my former students, especially Lacoma Akate, Rose Angelosi, Tricia Cook, Rhonda Gonzalez, Catherine Hoover, Katie Luck-Mellis, and Tracy Mills. And I love this this photo. It's a photo of a very crowded disability protest in a street of a major city. And the sign reads, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." A quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which in a way brings us full circle back to our one of our first slides today, when I talked about how I was influenced early by the work of Martin Luther King and all of his other foot soldiers in this African-American civil rights movement. And you can see third from the left is Judy Heumann, and first from the right is Justin Dart. So I'll use this as a transition to the next phase of my talk. I thought I'd just, since I wanted to encourage people to invest their time and energy in advocacy and allyship with the disability community, I'd just sort of outline some advantages to being an ally to the disability community. Living with a disability is an inevitable part of the life cycle for most people. Here below are useful personal life lessons that non-disabled folks can learn as an ally through collaborative cross-disability advocacy on disability issues. Seeing and reflecting on disabled folks' agency and resilience in combating the barriers of disability discrimination can help in understanding oneself better by exposing and disproving one's unproductive implicit assumptions about disability and their self-implications. Hopefully, this will stimulate recognition of one's own counterpart capacity to manage current life situations. Frequently I hear people say, when they see a person with a significant disability, oh, I can't imagine what that person's life is like, or I'd die if that happened to me, or things like that. And being around a lot of people with disabilities easily disabuses you of the baggage that we carry as outsiders to the disability experience. And it can help us recognize that we too would have the capacity to meet life's challenges in whatever way they come to us. Also, by working within a diverse disability community, one can learn about specific strategies and resources, as well as a general coping attitude that could help people deal with future disability challenges when they emerge. And if you're working in the rehab profession, it can expand your repertoire of tools that you can share with clients who are at an early phase of adjusting to their own disability. And you also get to meet interesting people like those I've just reviewed. I'm just going to briefly talk about the emergence of the disability justice movement. And I'll just give a quote from a book, an anthology called Skin, Tooth, Bone, The Basis of Movement is Our People, by a collective in San Francisco known as Sin's Invalid. And the following excerpt capsulizes how an evolving disability justice movement distinguished its priorities from those of the disability rights movement and the independent living movement. Quote, in 2005, queers with disability and activists of color began discussing a, quote, second wave of disability rights. Many of these first conversations happened between Patty Byrne and Mia Mingus. These were two queer women. They each had a disability and they were women of color who were incubated in progressive and radical movements, you know, the women's movement and other movements, which had failed to address ableism in their politics. So despite the fact that they were progressive organizations, they still were, you know, victims of the ableist culture that we grow up in. A single issue civil rights framework is not enough to explain the full extent of ableism and how it operates in society. We can only truly understand ableism by tracing its connections to heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, end quote. And here's a nice picture that I got also from that book. It shows a picture of an African-American man, shirtless, and he has his hands cupped in front of him like he's holding out something or ready to receive something in his hands. And the caption for the photo is, all bodies and minds are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with no body left behind. This is disability justice. And here are some strategies I'd like to suggest for advancing disability justice. Number one, we can all, I think, do a better job of educating policy makers and fellow citizens with information that explains how changes that promote disability justice also benefit the common good. For example, as you all know, universal design makes things easier for everyone to access and use. Full employment strategies with needed accommodations or supports provide for more flexible, successful work environments and create stronger economies by increasing the tax-paying population. Meaningful social inclusion creates higher morale due to less stress from isolation, thereby improving the mental health and quality of life of the individual and the community. And I think as a parallel to that, we're seeing a lot of mental health issues that consequent to the isolation of the pandemic that we experienced for the last 2.5 or so years. And this is an idea of mine, to promote inclusion of disability, the disability community, within the BIPOC diversity framework. This is a conceptual framework and an acronym to refer to various groups of previously marginalized and are continually marginalized in many settings, and underrepresented and discriminated against group. And so my suggestion is that we add, due to their historical and persistent discrimination, the disability community deserves interventions for attaining social justice. And so I think we should add D to BIPOC, D for disabled or disabled, to make it BIPOC, which would stand for Black, Indigenous, and people of color or disabled. My third suggestion is to invigorate intergroup collaboration and coalition building with cross-cultural humility and sensitivity, which are essential whenever you're doing cross-cultural or intergroup work to build partnership, to, lay down your stereotypes and open your heart and mind and ears to learning about the issues and priorities and concerns of the group that you want to work with, in order to expand the size and power of the network of advocates and supporters of disability justice and other social justice communities. Okay, so here are my farewell messages. Each one of us is a worthy, interdependent, ever-changing person with needs to be fulfilled and contributions of time, talent, and spirit to give. That is why everyone deserves and benefits from an inclusive world where disability justice and human rights are embraced and effectively sustained. Let us be focused, but also joyful as we collaborate to achieve that liberated, accommodating world together. I'm eager to learn from your comments, questions, and input now and in the future. My email address is on the first slide. Thanks for your attention and interest, and I give you my best wishes for meaning and hopefulness in your personal and professional lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCarthy, for just a wonderful presentation. And there were a good amount of comments in the chat box, as well as you were going through your presentation. It looks like Chris Reed had mentioned Dark was a delightfully passionate, mission-driven person. Eliana Martinez-Lugo had shared that there's a documentary about Crip Camp as well, and had shared the YouTube link. Some feedback too, excellent movie. And then Vicky had shared some ARCA history that Peg Nosek had received the James Garrett Career Research Award by herself in 2017, and a lot of wonderful feedback thanking you and saying great presentation. Can't wait to get a hold of some of those resources, and a comment as well by Candace. I have some social justice initiatives that I'm working on for persons with disabilities, and we'll reach out to you, Dr. McCarthy.
Good.
Well, and at this time, if anyone has any questions for Dr. McCarthy based on the presentation or based on just his wonderful career of leadership and service and advocacy and the wealth of knowledge that he brings, please feel free to either write that in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself if you'd like, whichever is most comfortable for you. We welcome any questions you may have.
And suggestions for improvement. We're all lifelong learners, and I'm certainly open to getting feedback or encouraging suggestions, and I hope there was something new or interesting for everyone. I know that a lot of what I talked about is part of our profession's history, and so I'm sure you we're familiar with a lot of the people that I talked about, but part of this project that I'm doing, that this is part of, is sort of my gratitude to all of the people that have welcomed me into their world, the disability community, and scholars and teachers, etc., who've helped shape a career that I found enormously exciting and stimulating. And so, and I try to practice gratitude in retirement. You have more time to reflect on it and do it. So I appreciate your abiding with my reading everything, but we got done in time. So if there are any final questions, or you can write me or send me things that I should know and promote, I'd be happy to hear from you all.
Thank you, Dr. McCarthy. And it looks like there is a question, if it might be possible to share this presentation. I know we'll have a recording that will be accessible on the ARCA website. And we also have a list of the references that Dr. McCarthy had throughout the presentation, so we can definitely share those as well afterwards for our participants. And we also had a question, Dr. McCarthy, based on your experiences, do you find that there are states that are more open or the opposite, closed to disability rights?
Well, I used to think there was that sort of, hierarchy of awareness or understanding. And certainly there are programs in several states that are much more progressive than others. And, that was frequently talked about when we talked about the VR system, and some states had, more forgiving or welcoming regulations. But I find that, in my travels, and that's another thing, I've been grateful to go many, many places to learn and to share my work. And I think everywhere in pockets, there are people doing very interesting things, and they could be in a rural, sort of quote unprogressive state. And so I think it's pretty much spread out. I'm sure that there are people who live in areas where they wish that things were more welcoming and more accessible and more accommodating. And I just would encourage them to, gather a group together. But I think, not that it's necessarily evenly distributed, but I always feel like, if you network hard enough, you will find kindred spirits and people who will stimulate your mind and your motivation to do good work. And I think we have a culture that invites that, thank God. And and I also should say that I did not thank my family, but I have a wonderful wife of 40 plus years and 3 sons, and they have put up with my travels all over places and my asking them to read my writings to see if they're as understandable as I try to make them. And they've just been loving and supportive family, and I am so grateful that I have that resource with me. We've built it together, and so I wanted to give a little shout out to them. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. McCarthy. And just wanting to, in our last few moments here, just share a few of the additional comments with you. Ginny had mentioned this seems to align well with current research and ongoing training being done within the National Center for START Services. Candace had shared, great presentation. I love learning about those who paved the way for the betterment of all. The fight is never ending to improve rights. And Andrea had shared, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and knowledge with us. The disability movement history is so important to our profession. As a member of the community, as well as counselor education and supervision doctoral student, disability and advocacy and educating my colleagues about making classrooms more accessible and inclusive is a passion of mine. And just a lot of wonderful praise for your presentation, Dr. McCarthy. And I know Dr. McCarthy will be here with us for the next 15 minutes or so if anyone has any additional questions. But We would like to just take a moment as well and thank everyone for choosing the American Rehabilitation Counseling Association to meet your professional development needs. We hope that each of you will return for more exciting sessions in the near future. And in the chat box, you will find the link for the evaluation form in order to get your certificate of attendance and for continuing education. And thank you again. And on behalf of ARCA, we would like to extend a most sincere and heartfelt thank you to Dr. McCarthy for just a wonderful presentation, for all of your continued leadership and advocacy and service. And we're most grateful to you for all the wonderful work you do, Dr. McCarthy. And we hope that everyone enjoys the rest of the day and the weekend ahead. And of course, Dr. McCarthy will be here for any additional questions in the upcoming moments, but we can go ahead and end the recording here. And thank you all so much.
Thank you. Namaste.